Hi, everybody. I wanted to post a short pod lecture for your consideration and open up a chat space as well so that we can have a dialogue around gaze theory. I had mentioned this in a previous class, but I'll remind you what gaze theory is about. And it's essentially about a power dynamic that's created between someone who is looking and someone who is being looked at. Looking versus looked at. And I've got a lot of theory here to talk about from the past 40 years or so. It was a majorly important film theory. And then it also had larger sort of cultural significance. And I would like to ask you for the discussion how things are changed in the Instagram era when now everybody, it seems, has control of their image and to some extent their identity in person and online. So how is this theory made contemporary, and also what parts of it are maybe no longer relevant? So it's a fascinating moment in cultural history. It had a real impact, I think, across media and into society. I think it really had an interesting um, uh, legacy, and you'll see why once we get through and talking about the theory about power and looking, or power and being seen. Okay, so let's just get started right into it. Gaze theory was born out of feminist film theory, and you guys can see from the slide here, the feminist critics, mostly primarily all women, wanted to examine the way that other women were portrayed in classical Hollywood cinema. So this theory is about the cinema from the 1940s through the 1970s. So we're talking about a little bit older cultural history, but certainly once this became widespread and part of the standard academic discourse in so many different departments, it morphed, it became part of a much longer, much more detailed dialogue that's still continuing around identity, around gender, um, around pronouns now. But a lot of this can be traced back to the beginnings in feminist film theory and this objection and objectification of female characters in classical Hollywood cinema. So it's important to know when we go into this that that's what we're talking about. This is about movies like Casablanca, um, Wizard of Oz, films from the classical Hollywood era before before the studios were broken up, the golden era of Hollywood movie making. And it's specifically focused on Hollywood because that's what they wanted to criticize, right? It wasn't about indie filmmakers like John Waters in Baltimore making movies for next to nothing. It wasn't about experimental filmmakers like Maya Deren. This critique is of the mainstream, the big movies of that, period before the 1970s. So um, it was looking in particular at that type of film. And what the critics identified was this sense of the male gaze looking at the female characters in the movie. But what's somewhat interesting about this is it wasn't necessarily only about men watching the movies. It was about the men in the movies watching the women in the movies, and where an audience positioned itself vis-a-vis that relationship. So think about watching Casablanca. According to gaze theory, feminist film theory, um, there is a power dynamic between the Humphrey Bogart male character and the Ingrid Bergman female character that's played out in the audience through that act of looking. And what's so fascinating about it is the notion that the audience would look through the eyes of the male character at the female body. So pretty interesting, some real relevance, creating a power dynamic where the male character has some sort of power over the female character. But what's fascinating about this, and makes this even a little bit more interesting, is that women in the audience, according to the theory, also looked through the male eyes at the female character. So it created a very problematic construct in which everybody's focus was shifted through this lens and through this dynamic of one character having a sort of powerful relationship over the other. And so that's what's fascinating about gaze theory. And maybe one of the things that makes it a little older, maybe, and a little bit less obsolete, is that I think we can now argue that that construct has been upended in some ways because so many different entities have control over media production. It's no longer just five studios in Los Angeles making media for the whole world. It's all of us making media on digital platforms for all of us, right? And I think what you can see coming out of this is that perhaps this construct absolutely still exists, but also there are alternate constructs as well, that have grown out of alternate filmmaking traditions. So here's an example of traditional Hollywood movie making with the female being the object of the male's gaze, the male's looking. And you can think about some scenes in Pretty Woman that set up this construct. It's pretty clear. And this is the kind of film, even though it was made after this theory was first proposed in the 1970s, this is a 1980s movie. We see in the construction of this movie, in the way that the camera is placed, and the male character and the female character are placed, and the way that her body is displayed for his eyes, and the audience looks through his eyes at Julia Roberts. All this stuff has some real relevance in this film, even though it occurs again after the theory was first explored in academia, but certainly not after it was being digested in real culture outside of the college environment, right? So the real culture had to catch up with academics in so many ways here. Um, Fatal Attraction, very famous instance of the male police officers gazing at the female suspect in this film, and it the director really plays with this, and it's probably self-referential in some ways. It's probably meta, in that the director was probably aware of this theory as this film was being made. It's pretty interesting, kind of dynamic in this film, but certainly a clear example of the same thing that we see in Casablanca and Pretty Woman here, Fatal Attraction. No, sorry, Basic Instinct. Basic Instinct. Okay, so unequal power dynamic, um, that's shown in the characters and is reflected in the larger society, and that's the theory that these theoreticians offered to academia and then to the larger culture, and it stuck. It took, and so when I'm studying film myself as an undergraduate and then a graduate student in the 80s and 90s, this was brought up in my classes, right? It was the professors were talking about this. So if you're interested in pursuing this, Claire Johnston, Pam Cook, and then certainly Laura Mulvey is probably the most important name on this list. She is in the article "Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema," the person that brought all of the thinking into a focal point and then blew it out into society as a whole. So academic disciplines grew up out of a response to this essay, and it's a really interesting read. And certainly, if you guys are considering graduate studies in film theory, you'll want to read that article to see what she saw in 1973, but also how things have changed in now, what are we, 50 years later, or close to 50 years later. Okay, so I've already characterized this. I'm not going to read all this on the screen, but you're certainly welcome to read through this. But essentially, it's about that relationship and the audience looking through the eyes of the male character at the female body. Um, So you can see here her distinction between voyeuristic and fetishistic um, gaze, and how it fits into a larger construct around sexual repression, sexism, and gender uh, uh, unfairness, an imbalance of power between the genders. Okay, so Anne Kaplan followed up on this theory. She made it slightly more contemporary because we don't necessarily want to be reading theory that's 50 years old. We want to be thinking about the contemporary world. Some of this older theory, Michel Foucault, who I bring up in a lot of classes, is still totally relevant. Mulvey's still relevant, but also let's talk about more contemporary theorists. And you can certainly, again, if you guys are pursuing this for an essay in a communication class or in graduate school, you can make this theory more contemporary. And some of the ways that I might suggest, and I'm basically done here, but some of the ways I might suggest that we could make this more contemporary is let's start thinking about different constructs, and let's start talking about the female gaze, right? When women are making movies, when they're producing and writing and directing and acting, you have to consider the fact that the gaze is now shifted, right? The power dynamic is now shifted. And what does that mean? How do these films read differently? So I have two examples here. Juno and Lady Bird are two, I think, very good examples of Hollywood film that's just shifted in its focus. It's less problematic in a lot of ways. I also propose that there is an alternate gaze. Certainly, if you look at a film like Tangerine, and I brought that film up a lot. Although Sean Baker is not transgendered, but his characters in this film are, and they're treated with a great deal of respect by the filmmaker, by the camera, and certainly you could argue that this film is offering a trans gaze in the film. We could talk about ethnic gaze, and perhaps a film like Black Panther is maybe a great way of framing that thinking. Um, Film by a black director for a black audience primarily, and how that construct, how the gaze was set up in that film. Racial, same thing. And then finally, the last thing I would talk about is economic gaze, because now that we're in an era where filmmaking is significantly less expensive in a lot of cases, perhaps poor people can start making movies using their telephones and free editing software. And so perhaps we'll see that kind of alternate gaze start to bubble up in the content that's created by filmmakers living that particular experience. So that is a summary of the power of looking. And the last thing I would ask is think about something like Instagram, where um, people own essentially their image, or they own they have the ability to control the way they're seen by the world. And so maybe Instagram makes this even more complex and more interesting as we look forward into the next sort of era of thinking about looking and power and dynamics.